In our increasingly connected society, it's hard to imagine cases where digital evidence would not be important. Yet the availability of forensic science is still not equitable for defendants, specifically access to digital forensics expertise. Marcus Rogers is here in studio to discuss what he calls a broken model. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for inviting me.
So let's go back. It's been 15 years since a report highlighted the inequities when it comes to access to digital forensic evidence. So how much has changed since then?
It's actually changed quite a bit, and not for the better, honestly, because what's happened in the past 15 years is technology has just exploded. So technology has changed, and we have new devices we didn't have back then, and the adoption of technology by people has increased. Everybody's got a cell phone, you've got smart devices, you've got health applications that measure your heart rate and your breathing and your sleeping, your car is keeping track of where you're going. So there is more technology, more digital evidence, and like you said, it's hard to imagine an investigation where digital evidence isn't going to be part of that investigation. And there's just so much of it now. And because of that expansion with technology and the amount of digital evidence and the fact that it's important in every case, it's even more important then to have the equal access to the technology, to the tools, and to the expertise to be able to say, okay, both sides are being able to represent the case properly in court. And because we haven't really kept up with a lot of the ability for the tools to be available to everybody to use, or the technology, we're seeing a bigger gap probably now than we probably had about 10, 12 years ago between the affordability of this technology and the experts, and the fact that the prosecution has labs, they've got funding, and quite often the defense can avail themselves of that type of technology or those type of funds. So you see a little bit of a spread in that gap of equality between the two.
So what would you say are the biggest challenges or obstacles when it comes to the use of digital evidence?
Probably the biggest obstacle is the sheer volume. There is just so much digital evidence out there. There's just so much evidence, there's so much data that we generate every day. You've got your smartphone, you've got your car, you've got your athletic devices, and it's a huge amount of information. And it's almost overwhelming to try and collect all that data and then make sense of it. The other thing that it's impacted is, where does that evidence exist? Before, it was basically you had a computer or a laptop or maybe a cell phone, but now we have the cloud, we have social media. This information is everywhere, and it's not necessarily contained in a device that you could go to and say, okay, this is what I have to look at, and I know how much evidence. Now, part of the challenge is, where does this stuff even exist? And if it exists outside of a jurisdiction, how do we legally get access to that information?
And yeah, I mean, is that part of it, being able to access some of that information?
Oh, absolutely. Like I said, it's a challenge to identify where the stuff exists. A lot of the technology now, you heard of the Internet of Things, right? A lot of that technology that uses the Internet of Things, the connected devices, it's really not storing the data on the device, it's being pushed to the cloud. And we're not sure exactly where or who has access or which company has collected all this information. So you have to identify it, and then once you identify where it might be, then you have to look at, okay, do we have the technology to get that information in a way that's going to be admissible in a court of law? And if it's in a country that we don't necessarily have a jurisdictional agreement with, or we might not be on friendly terms with, how do we get that information? And some of that information might be crucial to either exonerating somebody or proving their guilt.
Our focus today is on trends in technology. So what can you tell us about what you're noticing in digital forensics?
The biggest trend, there's two big trends that are kind of interrelated. The biggest trend is automation. As I mentioned, there is just so much evidence, there's so much data. The old days of an analyst sitting down and physically looking at all that evidence by a human being, those days are gone. We just can't do that. So we have to automate the tools. So the tools are doing things extremely quick that a human used to be able to do. They're doing it faster and more accurate, and hopefully
more accurately,
more precise, we hope. And then we have AI and machine learning, because one of the things we have to be able to do now, it's one thing to collect all this evidence, it's another to make sense of it so somebody can make a decision on it. So what you're seeing with AI and with machine learning is not they're making the final decision. We never want to see that happen. I'm a fan of AI, but I don't want it saying you're guilty and you're not.
That's a scary thought.
Yeah, what I want it to tell me, or what I want it to do, or what we're seeing now is it's going to triage. It's going to take all this information and say, you know what, based on the training, based on these parameters, I think this is the information that is specific to what you're looking for or to the case, and then a human sits down with that information that's now small enough, hopefully, that we can actually deal with it and look at it in a reasonable amount of time and go, okay, this is what I have to focus on. So basically what it's doing is it's taking this vast amount of information, filtering it down to what it thinks is the information that's most relevant, and then the human, the investigator, comes in and says, okay, now we'll make the decision, we'll look at the context, we'll make those things that humans are really good at doing, looking at the hunches and expanding the investigation. So that's what we're seeing the trend, is this filtering of all this mass amount of information. What is a little scary about that, though, is the assumption that it's been trained properly. The assumption that it is actually making those decisions in a way that we would have made and in a way that we can understand that, okay, this is what it's doing. And sometimes what ends up happening is we lose sight of what decisions it's making to come down to, well, this is what we think you should focus on. And that never makes the courts comfortable. They want to know the path back. So why did it choose this information and not that? Why was this important? And if we can't see all of it, then we want to make sure that, okay, we didn't miss anything over here, and this is exactly what we need to be looking at.
So what kind of checks and balances are in place to make sure that it's looking at the right kind of information?
That's the struggle right now. And this is where these models are being tested. There's a lot of development on proper training for these. And right now it's pretty much kind of unregulated. So a lot of this comes down to trust of the community to the vendors. And a lot of the vendors work with the law enforcement community, the investigator community, the prosecution, and are listening to, okay, you know what, this is how we want to train. And we still want to have some accountability. So even though you might be able to say, this is what you needed, if we need to go back and say, well, maybe we want to look at something, can we go in there and tune it? Can we go in there and say, well, that's nice, but in this case, I think I need the information that might be over here. But again, it's really kind of a blind trust right now that is doing it properly.
One of the greatest benefits of being a member of AAFS is the access to year-round educational opportunities. So can you explain what some of those are?
Yeah, a good example of that is the journal that the Academy puts out, the JFS, that has excellent peer-reviewed articles. It's got some of the latest technology that's happening, some of the stuff's going out there. You can't see, you can't find an area that's not publishing in the JFS. The other is the access to webinars. So now we don't just have to come to the yearly conference like we are at today, but you actually have in between, you have webinars and seminars, and you actually have training now that Academy members and non-members can go online and basically say, okay, I want to know about X, and they can sit down, they can do this at their own pace, and they could do a course on something. They could listen to some of the experts debate something. They could basically get more in depth about somebody's paper they just wrote. So the webinars and the seminars and the stuff that they're actually doing online is a huge advantage to the membership, and it's probably one of the best educational opportunities that we have in the Academy.
And it sounds like it's pretty convenient. What else can you tell us about AAFS Connect?
And that is actually an example of that education. And that was actually one of the past presidents, Carl. He really pushed behind this digitizing of information. So it wasn't just you came to the annual event and then you went home and you never talked to anybody and you didn't have any information. So how can we expand that out, and how can we take some of the information that was at this event, because not everybody, there are such fabulous talks and scientific papers and stuff, you can't go to all of them. Right. So how can we put some of those ones online so everybody now can go back and say, oh, I want to see that. Oh yeah, I'm interested in this, and not have to pick and choose.
So if somebody misses something, they can find it right there.
Exactly, yeah, and that really has expanded the opportunities for people to kind of break out of their silos. Forensics is very multidisciplinary, but when we come to these conferences, we tend to get, I'm going to focus on these things, I don't get to go out here, but now we have the opportunity outside of the conference to be able to, to expand our knowledge and go, oh, that's really interesting, I need to look at that. So that's what the idea behind the Connect is to connect the membership outside of just the general meeting, and to provide it in the modern context of what people are very comfortable with now. The generation of forensic scientists now are different than when I started. They're very used to online. They're very used to webinars and seminars and panel discussions that are happening online, and that's what the Connect is trying to take advantage of. This is the new learning medium, so why don't we take advantage of that?
How do the disparities in access to digital forensics affect the outcomes of legal cases for defendants? And can you share specific instances or types of cases where this inequity is most pronounced?
Right, and that goes back to that digital evidence is part of almost every investigation. And it doesn't matter what type of investigation that you're involved in, you're going to have a phone, maybe it's a health device, and that is actually going to be used by the prosecution to look at. And like I mentioned, they have labs, they have trained people, they have budgets to do that with. Quite often, especially if you're dealing with something that has to go through one of the defense, and it's a legal aid or one of these defense, these kind of not-for-profit defense, they don't have those budgets. Mm-hmm. They still need to be able to take that information and look at it the same way that the prosecutor was able to look at it, but without having that money to do it, it's very difficult. Experts they're not cheap. It requires a lot of training, a lot of expertise. The software is not cheap. It's very expensive for the software, and unless you're using that software, you can't compare apples to apples. You can't look at, well, they're using software X and we're using this free piece of software. We're seeing something that, well, is that because you're using a different piece of software? So the access to the software. So quite often, it's in the cases where you have somebody that really can't afford the legal fees or to pay for this or to take it to some large company to do what needs to be done. That's kind of what the prosecutor has as resources for them to do. So those type of cases are usually the ones where you see this really big disparity. And it's not like, okay, well, they could find something that law enforcement did wrong, but you could at least, as the lawyer, say, we mounted a proper defense. Mm-hmm. If this actually is what happened, we can confirm that, yes, that happened, and there wasn't a miscarriage at all of justice. It actually happened that way. But not knowing that puts everybody in a very, very difficult situation.
Yeah, it sounds like the defense is up against a lot more in these cases than the prosecution is. The prosecution kind of has a leg up.
Right, and even the prosecution, though, still has to deal with technology changes and the sheer volume of information. But they do, like I said, they have their own lab, they have their own resources. Defense doesn't have that.
So what do you think needs to be done to rectify some of these inequities?
I think it's a combination of policy and technology. From a policy perspective, and this was something that report had talked about, is really coming up with a model where labs are not tied to the prosecution. So you could have state labs that were neutral, that were funded by government agencies that weren't part of Department of Justice or something like that, that would, could be funded by some other type of more neutral, for lack of a better term, government agency, or even by private sector or something. So that would basically level the playing field. So both prosecution and defense now have access to the same resources without having to worry about the price tag on that. And that's actually something that some of the smaller police agencies really were pushing for, because they're on the hook as well. Mm-hmm. Some of these smaller agencies can't pass it up to the FBI. Right. That it's not important enough. It's not something they're going to look, or even the state police. And yet they're being told, well, you have to investigate this. And they're going, there's 4 of us in the department. Mm-hmm. How do we do this cell phone? What do we do with it? Having access then to something like that, where even they could tap into it, would be great. So that's from a policy perspective. Technology is actually trying to deal with this a little bit, and this is where some of that automation and some of the companies and the vendors are realizing there's this disparity, and they're willing to come out with kind of either less cost or kind of more open source alternatives to what they have. So at least there could be a basic look at what's happening. It's still not quite at the same level, but really it's more, like I said, of a policy than a technology problem.
So looking towards the future, how do you see the field of digital forensics evolving to better serve justice?
And I think that this is that AI done correctly and machine learning done correctly is going to really help. Again, part of what's really a problem right now is the sheer demand. The investigators are basically overwhelmed with the number of cases, so they haven't got time to go look at everything that they would really like to look at. You have enough to lay the charge, that's it, go on to the next case. Mm-hmm. Or there's just so much evidence and it sits there for a couple of years until somebody gets a chance to look at it because other things stack up. This is where that triage model, where the technology can say, okay, this is important, this maybe isn't, here's the information that you need over here, and we can automate this so you don't have to go and spend $100,000 a year training investigators to be at that level of, that they could get right down into the weeds. Right. I never want to see it just be a point and click, but there really, in some cases, doesn't need to be, you have a PhD in computer science to get some of that information out, or have hundreds of $1,000s worth of training if you can trust the software is going to do part of that correctly and let the investigators do the investigation part.
So it takes a big chunk of the workload off the investigators.
Absolutely.
How important is public awareness and understanding of the role of digital forensics in the justice system?
Oh, it is huge. There is so much misinformation and myths. I blame TV for this.
Me too.
But you see these shows where, you know, it's actually pretty boring to watch a digital forensics person do it, because you got a screen and you're clicking.
Right.
It's not these bits and bytes flying through the air and you can't go, oh, that's the person. It's not like that.
It's not as fascinating as they make it look in our living rooms?
No, unfortunately, we don't have the blue lights going off, but it's not like that. Sometimes it can be, but not usually. It's pretty boring watching people go through. So the public, unfortunately, gets their education on what digital evidence is and how accurate it is and what you can do from TV, and then they expect that to happen when you go to court.
And they want those results,
They want those results. What do you mean you couldn't figure out where that person, and it can happen for both the defense and the prosecution because they have unreasonable expectations of the investigator. Well, on TV, that investigator was able to see that, look at that, go to their website and tell you they were sitting there at that table. Well, that's not realistic.
Yeah.
So it's very, very important to do that. So not just the myths, but also the reasonable expectations, and to understand that it's not infallible. It's not 100%. It's relatively accurate, but there are cases where it isn't. So even if somebody's going to become a potential juror, they need to understand that technology is just a tool, okay? And it can make mistakes. And so they have to understand how much weight. So even if they trust that the evidence is correct, how much weight should they give to that evidence? Extremely important. We just don't want that education to be coming from TV.
So digital forensics often involves some really sensitive data. So how do you balance that with people's rights to privacy?
Yeah, and that is a balancing act. And this is really what a lot of the courts really struggle with for search warrants and things like this. Because as I said, everybody has a phone and everybody has, a social media website. You don't want to be basically going on a fishing expedition looking for everything when it's something that is very specific to an incident, an event, or a time frame. So it's always a very big balancing act. And again, this is where some of that automation can happen. You can go in and say, well, I just want information related to you. Your name, your address, maybe your social media account. And then a person isn't going through and looking at all that and saying, well, this is all I need. It's being automated. The investigator only gets to look at it after that redaction has happened, and we can look at that. But like I said, it's a real balancing act, and law enforcement struggles with it. I know that the defense struggles with it, because again, everything is on there, but you only may want a little piece, or everything is on there that might not even relate to you, but to your friends, to somebody who's talked to you. Well, if they're not the subject of the investigation, then it's a little bit invasive for that information to show up in an investigation. In the old days, we used to just basically, because there wasn't a really understanding, we took everything and then we decided what we need. That's not happening anymore, and that's a good thing. You have to be precise, and then you have to say, how am I going to limit to just that information that I think is going to be necessary for this? And if it turns out that there's more, you can always go back and say, we need to expand this slightly.
Marcus, any final thoughts you want to share?
People shouldn't fear technology. Technology is great. The fact that there's evidence out there that we can get, that's just the reality of it. And although, like I said, I've kind of been disparaging AI and technology, it's not to mean that there's something wrong. We just have to be sure we understand what it's doing, and we have to be in control of how we use that. I never want to see technology actually have the final decision on somebody's guilt or innocence. I want that just to be one of the tools that we use, and let the human come back and say, yes, I think this is what happened, because we're better at doing that than any AI we have right now.
Thanks for taking the time to stop by and talk with us today.
Thank you very much.